The conflict began quietly, almost innocently, in the way most HOA disputes do, without warning, without context, and without the slightest ounce of empathy. The neighborhood of Crestfall Meadows had always marketed itself as a picturesque suburban enclave, a place where lawns remained perfectly trimmed, mailboxes matched the approved color palette, and the HOA board monitored every inch of property like self-appointed guardians of architectural purity. For years, the facade held. But facades were fragile things, and sometimes it only took one family doing something necessary, humane, and undeniably reasonable to reveal just how brittle the HOA's power really was. The Spencer family had lived on Willow Fern Drive for nearly a decade. Their home, modest, well-kept, and unremarkably beige, fit the HOA's vision of conformity with almost comical adherence. They never missed dues, never left their trash cans out past allowed hours, and never challenged a single rule. They existed quietly, blending into Crestfall Meadows the way the HOA preferred. Obediently, invisibly, and without disruption. That changed the moment Martin Spencer returned home from the hospital. More than half the neighborhood had known Martin as the cheerful retiree who loved woodworking in his garage, often sharing handmade birdhouses with neighbors. He had always been active, always moving, always present. But after a sudden medical emergency and a complicated surgery, Martin's mobility vanished. Overnight, the steps leading up to his own front door became an impossible barrier. The world that had once been accessible shrank dramatically, leaving him dependent on a wheelchair and the mercy of the neighborhood's supposed community guidelines. For the Spencer family, installing a wheelchair ramp wasn't a choice, it was a necessity. They hired a certified contractor, followed all safety regulations, and made sure the ramp matched the exterior as best as possible. It was simple, functional, and tasteful. It wasn't flashy or oversized. It didn't obstruct the sidewalk or intrude on neighboring property. It existed for one purpose: to give Martin access to his home. For 3 days, life resumed with a new rhythm. The family helped Martin adjust. Neighbors who actually cared stopped by with casseroles, supportive words, and quiet reassurances that the ramp looked perfectly fine. Everything seemed normal until the envelope arrived. The letter came in the signature HOA cream-colored envelope, sealed with the authority of the board's emblem. A stylized leaf crest that felt less like a symbol of community and more like a reminder of who held the power. Inside was a formal violation notice printed in crisp, emotionless wording. The HOA demanded immediate removal of the wheelchair ramp for failure to submit proper architectural modification forms and violation of aesthetic uniformity guidelines. In addition, they issued a fine that wasn't small enough to ignore but large enough to sting. A calculated amount meant to ensure compliance without provoking open rebellion. The Spencers were stunned. The violation wasn't a warning, nor an invitation to discuss options. It was a decree, a condemnation of something deeply necessary and painfully human. The letter stated that the ramp detracted from the visual harmony of the neighborhood and introduced an unapproved structural modification inconsistent with the community's standards. Notably absent was any acknowledgement of Martin's disability, any hint of compassion, any suggestion that exceptions could be made for medical circumstances. Nothing, just cold, bureaucratic insistence. The HOA board, led by its notoriously rigid president Eleanor Harrington, had built its reputation on strict enforcement. Eleanor, a woman known to measure grass height with a ruler and leave anonymous notes on car windshields, seemed to relish the power her position granted. Under her leadership, Crestfall Meadows had become less of a community and more of a private fiefdom. The wheelchair ramp was, to her, not an accessibility feature but a breach in the HOA's immaculate facade. And she would tolerate no breach. What the HOA didn't anticipate was that the Spencers were not the sort of family to accept unreasonable punishment quietly, especially not when it affected the dignity and independence of someone they loved. For the first time since moving into Crestfall Meadows, they pushed back. They requested an urgent meeting with the board, hoping reason might prevail. The request was denied. They submitted medical documentation. The board refused to review it. They appealed to the community manager. They were redirected to the board. Every attempt at dialogue led to another wall. It became clear that the HOA wasn't simply enforcing a rule. They were digging in, taking a stand, and fully expecting the family to bow under pressure. But the Spencers were done bowing. It started with a post on a local community forum, written not with rage but with clarity and raw honesty. The story of Martin's situation and the HOA's refusal to accommodate his disability resonated far beyond their street. Neighbors who had quietly endured their own negative experiences with the HOA saw an opportunity to speak up. People who had been afraid of retaliation suddenly found courage. The post spread rapidly, shared, reshared, and circulated to nearby neighborhoods. Then came the moment no HOA ever expects. The story escaped the boundaries of Crestfall Meadows entirely. A local journalist, known for covering human interest stories and consumer rights disputes, reached out to the Spencers after seeing the viral post. The Spencers agreed to share what had happened, not out of spite, but out of necessity. The interview aired on a local news channel, highlighting the absurdity and cruelty of penalizing a disabled man for needing access to his own home. The report included footage of the ramp, the letter from the HOA, and the family's explanation of their attempts to resolve the matter. What followed was a reaction none of them could have predicted. The story ignited outrage across the city. Advocacy groups reached out. Social media exploded with support. Strangers began driving by the Spencer home, leaving encouraging notes on the lawn and dropping off care packages. Some residents gathered signatures for a petition demanding fair treatment and ADA-compliant accommodation rules. The Spencers' home, a once quiet beige house, became a focal point of community solidarity in the midst of this growing attention. The HOA board retreated into silence, issuing only a brief, rigid statement claiming the ramp violated established protocols and that the Spencers failed to follow proper procedures. But the tone of the statement only fueled public frustration. Instead of appearing firm, the HOA appeared indifferent, callous, and deeply out of touch. And that was before the media vans started arriving. By the end of the week, the street had turned into something resembling a press staging area. Cameras, reporters, and vehicles lined the sidewalks. The Spencers had unintentionally transformed their home into the center of a growing storm, one that threatened to expose far more about Crestfall Meadows than a simple ramp dispute. And the HOA, still refusing to back down, had no idea how far this storm was about to spread. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Crestfall Meadows no longer resembled the quiet, rule-bound suburb it had been for so many years. The once pristine neighborhood, so carefully curated by strict guidelines and the ever-watchful eyes of the HOA, was now filled with reporters, curious locals, advocacy volunteers, and residents lingering on their lawns, whispering updates to one another as though they were witnessing the climax of a long-hidden drama finally bursting into daylight. The news vans arrived before many neighbors had even poured their first cup of coffee, and every hour brought more attention, more outrage, and more pressure on the HOA board that had long assumed itself untouchable. The Spencers had not expected the story to explode like this. They had expected sympathy, maybe a few supportive comments, perhaps even a small local outcry. But what they got was a tidal wave of public condemnation directed at the HOA, each wave stronger than the last. What had begun as a simple plea for understanding had become a symbol of a much larger, much older struggle. Ordinary people fighting back against an HOA that believed its authority outranked humanity. With the rising media attention came the presence of disability rights groups, organizations that had spent years advocating for equitable access in housing and public spaces. They arrived equipped with knowledge, experience, and a determination the Spencers had never imagined they would have on their side. They held signs, organized peaceful gatherings, and educated passing neighbors about rights protected under federal law. For the first time, the Spencers felt less alone, and more like they had become part of something bigger. Crestfall Meadows, once silent and stiff with conformity, now pulsed with conversations that had been suppressed for years. Homeowners who had long dealt with arbitrary fines, capricious board decisions, and intimidation suddenly found themselves surrounded by a crowd that validated their grievances. Neighbors shared stories, some dating back years, stories of unfair enforcement, rude encounters with board members, and an unspoken fear of retaliation if they ever dared to push back. The ramp had not only exposed injustice, it had exposed a culture of control. Meanwhile, the HOA board remained conspicuously absent. No board member appeared in person. No apology or reconsideration came. Instead, curt statements trickled out through official channels, each one carefully worded but increasingly tone-deaf. The board insisted it was simply enforcing established procedures, attempting to present itself as rational administrators maintaining order. But these statements were met with skepticism, then mockery, and finally outright hostility. Their refusal to acknowledge the humanity behind the situation, the man trapped in his home because of inaccessible steps, made them appear cold and authoritarian. The community's anger grew not only because of the board's decisions, but because of its silence. People wanted answers. They wanted accountability. And most of all, they wanted to know how a neighborhood that claimed to value community could treat one of its own residents with such indifference. As the media pressure intensified, the board held a private emergency meeting, one they believed would remain confidential. But Crestfall Meadows was no longer a place where secrets stayed hidden. Rumors quickly leaked out. Some said the board was divided, with a few members urging compromise while others, led by Eleanor Harrington, pushed to stand firm against what she called external influence and emotional manipulation. Others whispered that the HOA had begun consulting legal counsel, an action that only further inflamed public suspicion. Still, even as tensions escalated, the Spencers remained composed. They cooperated with reporters, answered questions patiently, and never indulged in anger or theatrics. Their calm, dignified presence made the HOA's rigidity appear even more unreasonable. Every interview, every photo, every story reinforced the same narrative. A family trying to live with dignity, and a board trying to crush them under the guise of aesthetic standards. By midweek, the street became a constant flurry of activity. Cars slowed at the entrance of Crestfall Meadows, hoping to catch a glimpse of the ramp house from the news. Volunteers set up canopies offering water and pamphlets about accessibility rights. Journalists rotated in shifts. At times, the Spencers felt overwhelmed, but they also felt supported in a way they had never experienced before. They realized the ramp had become more than a practical necessity. It had become a symbol of resistance. With increased visibility came scrutiny that the HOA had long avoided. Reporters began digging into board actions, interviewing other homeowners, and researching past decisions. Stories surfaced of petty fines, mysterious board elections with little oversight, and questionable use of HOA funds. Long-buried frustrations resurfaced like artifacts in a freshly overturned field. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. This was not simply a dispute about a ramp. It was a community reckoning. The tipping point came when a regional news station aired a segment comparing Crestfall Meadows bylaws to federal accessibility guidelines, highlighting discrepancies and potential legal violations. The report questioned whether the HOA's refusal to accommodate the ramp bordered on discriminatory practices. That single broadcast sent shockwaves across the neighborhood. For the first time, the board's actions weren't just viewed as cruel. They were viewed as potentially unlawful. And yet, amid the chaos, the Spencer home emerged as a place of unity. Neighbors visited frequently, bringing snacks to volunteers, offering emotional support, or simply standing on the lawn as a show of solidarity. The once quiet cul-de-sac transformed into a gathering place where people exchanged stories and planned actions. As night fell each evening, porch lights glowed across the neighborhood, symbolizing unity against the board's heavy-handedness. But as the community rallied, the HOA responded with increasing defensiveness. The board issued another terse statement, warning homeowners against unauthorized gatherings and disruptions to neighborhood order. The message, intended to intimidate, instead infuriated residents even further. Overnight, the HOA went from being a silent authoritarian presence to a widely mocked power struggling to maintain control. What the board failed to understand was that it was no longer facing a single family. It was facing an entire community and an audience far beyond it. The HOA's decades-long reign of unchecked authority was unraveling, thread by thread, under the harsh light of public scrutiny, and yet, for all the chaos surrounding Crestfall Meadows, something even more shocking was about to emerge. Something that would shatter whatever remained of the board's carefully crafted image and escalate the conflict to a level none of them could have imagined. In the days that followed, the pressure on the HOA intensified with a force no one in Crestfall Meadows had ever witnessed. What had started as a local controversy had become a full-fledged scandal, amplified by continuous media coverage and the relentless momentum of public outrage. The cul-de-sac where the Spencer family lived had become a symbol of resistance, but the true breaking point was yet to come. A moment that would expose the HOA in ways its board members could never have prepared for. It began when an investigative journalist from a regional station took a deeper interest in the unfolding drama. While other reporters focused on the ramp dispute, she sought the root of the issue, the HOA's long-standing culture of authoritarianism. Her investigation was meticulous, unearthing patterns that painted a far darker picture than anyone expected. She spoke with former board members who had resigned quietly over the years, citing disagreements with the leadership. She interviewed homeowners who had been fined for arbitrary infractions, intimidated into silence, or discouraged from attending meetings. Some shared their experiences anonymously, fearing retaliation even now. Others, emboldened by the growing movement, spoke openly for the first time. However, the most damning revelations came from documents, records that had been hidden in plain sight for years. The journalist obtained copies of the HOA's financial statements through public request laws. What she found shocked even the residents who had suspected the board of misconduct. The reports revealed unexplained expenses, vague administrative charges, and inconsistencies in how funds were allocated. Money meant for community improvements seemed to have evaporated into opaque categories with no detail. Contracts for landscaping and maintenance had been renewed repeatedly without competitive bidding, all awarded to the same small circle of vendors suspiciously connected to certain board members. These findings were compiled into a televised investigative segment that aired one evening at prime time. The broadcast didn't just mention the ramp. It framed the ramp as the spark that exposed a years-long pattern of questionable governance, financial mismanagement, and potential ethical violations. Viewers watched footage of the Spencer home juxtaposed against files that suggested the HOA board had been operating with little oversight and even less transparency. The segment ended with a statement that the station had attempted to contact the board for comment, but no one responded. As the broadcast ended, the neighborhood was transformed.
Phones rang nonstop.
Messages pinged in group chats. Families who had once merely tolerated the HOA's presence now openly questioned its legitimacy. The once fearsome board suddenly seemed vulnerable. For the first time, residents realized they had power, real power, to demand accountability. The next morning, the board attempted damage control. They released a statement claiming the financial discrepancies were misunderstandings and bookkeeping oversights. But by then, the community's patience had run out. Residents demanded an emergency town hall meeting, and under extreme pressure, the board was forced to agree. The meeting was held in the Crestfall Meadows Community Center, a place that had long served only as a backdrop to HOA-approved events, but now became the arena for a confrontation years in the making. The center overflowed with homeowners, volunteers, reporters, and even members of the advocacy groups who had supported the Spencers. The board members sat at the front behind a long table, their expressions stiff. Eleanor Harrington occupied the center seat, clutching her notes, her authority slipping by the second. The air was thick with tension as the meeting began. The mood of the crowd was unlike anything the board had experienced. Homeowners spoke one after another, voicing accumulated grievances, complaints about unfair fines, intimidation tactics, and lack of transparency. They demanded explanations for the financial inconsistencies. They questioned the decision to target the Spencers, refusing to accept the board's canned responses. The board tried to deflect blame, insisting they had followed procedure. But each deflection only fueled the community's anger. Then came the moment that sealed the board's fate. A former treasurer of the HOA stepped forward, someone who had resigned quietly years prior. She had watched the story unfold from afar, but the broadcast had pushed her to act. She revealed that she had once raised concerns about the very financial discrepancies now in question, but instead of addressing them, the board had pressured her to remain silent, dismissing her objections as unnecessary disruption. She had kept copies of documents, hoping the truth would one day matter. Now, she presented those documents before the entire community. The room erupted. The evidence was clear, the implications unavoidable. Mismanagement wasn't an accident. It was deliberate, and the board, led by Eleanor, had allowed it to continue unchecked. Under immense pressure, with cameras rolling and residents demanding resignations, the board's composure fractured. One member quietly stepped down. Another muttered something about hostile environments and walked out. Eleanor remained, but the once unshakable certainty in her demeanor vanished. She attempted to regain control, insisting that the board needed time to review all allegations. But her voice was drowned out by the crowd's calls for immediate action. The meeting concluded not with resolution, but with a collective decision. The community would vote to recall the board entirely. Petitions were circulated on the spot. Signatures poured in. By the end of the night, the required threshold had not only been met, it had been surpassed. Within days, the recall was official. The entire HOA board was removed. In the aftermath, a temporary committee composed of longtime residents and new volunteers took over. Their first official act was to revoke the violation notice and fines against the Spencers. Their second was to implement a clear, legally compliant accessibility policy. Their third was to initiate a full audit of HOA finances and operations to ensure transparency moving forward. The ramp, once the center of conflict, remained exactly where it belonged, untouched and unchallenged. For the Spencers, life slowly returned to normal. The media attention faded as new stories emerged. The volunteers moved on to their next advocacy efforts, and the neighborhood began healing. But Crestfall Meadows was forever changed. The silence that had once enveloped the community was replaced with conversations, collaboration, and a renewed sense of unity. Neighbors who barely knew one another before now shared a bond forged through collective action. As for the ramp, it became more than a practical necessity. It became a symbol of transformation. A reminder that one family's refusal to accept injustice had ignited a movement, exposed corruption, and reshaped an entire community. The Spencers had not sought a fight, but when the fight found them, they faced it with quiet determination. And because of that, Crestfall Meadows finally became what it had always pretended to be. A true community with the HOA restructured, trust slowly rebuilding, and the Spencers reclaiming their peace. The storm that had engulfed the neighborhood finally began to settle. But the lesson lingered, an unmistakable truth woven into the fabric of the community forever. All it took was a ramp to reveal the cracks in the system. And all it took was a community, awakened and united, to bring the old system crashing down.